You see the symbolism of it? Capital and labor destroy each other. It teaches a lesson, a moral lesson. It has social significance.
Who wants to see that kind of stuff?
Welcome to Season 5 of How Would Lubitsch Do It, a podcast in which we discuss the works of director Ernst Lubitsch, one film at a time. It's 1941, and Tim Brayton joins us to discuss Sullivan's Travels and Mr. Preston Sturges. Come visit ernstcast.com if you'd like show notes, resources as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing, a link to our Discord, or just to say hi. All right, so welcome back, Tim. I think with this, you now have an insurmountable lead as having the most episodes on this show, so congratulations.
I hope that's the case, and I hope if you end up doing like a sequel to this that I get to do like another 9 of them just to make sure that I keep a lead that no one else can possibly catch up with.
I'll go up to Kirsten Thompson and say, hey, want to record 6 more? Enough people have called this venture quixotic that I treat it as a mark of pride now, but you have given so much to this quixotic enterprise.
I mean, quixotic enterprises are a place that I like living. Since we started this, like after the first time you and I recorded an episode, I decided, you know, it'd be fun watching one Looney Tune a day in order until I go through all 1,000 Looney Tunes. So I'm not averse to the idea of what sort of dumb thing can I do that makes film watching math.
I've been tracking this and I've been actually counting down the shorts till you get to Dover Boys, which is my favorite short film of all time. And it was very rewarding when you got there.
It's way the hell up there on my list too, yeah.
Well, speaking of quixotic enterprises, we're here to talk about one of the most quixotic films, which is Sullivan's Travels by a director. When I brought up their name to you as a possibility for an episode, you replied with, I believe that your words were, that interests me.
That sounds like the just knockout enthusiasm that I try to bring to everything in my life.
Knockout enthusiasm is a good way to describe Preston Sturges, who I can say of all the classic Hollywood directors that we kind of talk about in this show and all the ones in general, he is one of the closest to my heart. His movies are both on paper and in practice simpatico with me as a person. I feel represented when I watch Miracle on Morgan's Creek in so many ways. But we're here to talk about Sturges by way of one of his films, like we've talked about a few other directors. And that film is Sullivan's Travels, his kind of meta comedy about Hollywood and about comedy. So, Tim, I'd like to ask you, by way of getting your thoughts on all this, why does Sturges interest you as a director?
I mean, it's tough. We were sort of discussing before we hit the record button, like, how does one get into talking about Sturges? It's difficult to sum him up in a simple way because there's so much density in his filmmaking, despite it all sort of feeling very simple. And I mean, part of it is that I just really like the kind of amount of brain power his films demand of you. I would say, in a sort of very localized sense, I think The Lady Eve has one of the perfect screenplays. Like, it is just so structurally tight, and the dialogue is perfect, and the characterizations are so exciting, and it has a cast that can really bring that to life. So I just respect the hell out of the man's craft and his talent. I also think that there's something really remarkable. He's basically the first writer-director of the sound era. I mean, in the silent era, we have some more options. We have certainly Charlie Chaplin, sort of Buster Keaton. But Preston Sturges is really the first person who was so incensed by what other directors did to the very tonally strange and complicated and very delicate screenplays he gave to them that he was just like, no one else but me knows what I was trying to get at with that script, so I have to do it myself. And then he proves it, basically. He comes up with just film after film that are just these incredibly complicated blends of satire and farce and screwball and romantic comedy. And in this case, strange swerves into dark message movie seriousness. I think there is such an incredible density of modes that every one of his films is working in. None of them are just one thing. And they're so fragile in a way, but as you're watching it, they don't feel that way. They don't feel fussy. They don't feel kind of delicate the way that, say, a Wes Anderson film might. They feel very kind of burly almost. And you're watching all these actors just kind of barrel their way into scenes. But I think it just took an extraordinarily careful, deft hand to get these things to where they are tonally.
It's almost difficult to know where to begin with his films because they are so remarkable in so many wildly varying ways. Mm-hmm. It feels like when you mention his deft controlling hand, that's true. But what is also true is that the experience of watching his films is like watching a movie without the guardrails on. Mm-hmm. You don't know when the movie is going to suddenly veer into a different genre. which he tends to do every 10 to 20 minutes.
Yep.
You never know when he's going to do something that feels completely beyond the pale of what you thought was in the cards for that movie in so many ways, whether it be tonally, structurally. I mean, Miracle on Morgan's Creek, famously the climax, suddenly Mussolini, Hitler, and the Canadians get involved in a small town comedy. It's incredible.
It is. And I feel, to compare it to the reason we're here today, Ernst Lubitsch, I would very confidently say if someone loved a Preston Sturges film, I would feel comfortable recommending that person see other Preston Sturges films. But I couldn't do the thing where I know you would like this film because they're the same film. If you like Maurice Chevalier making dirty jokes, Lubitsch has got you covered. There's multiple films that you can go to and get that experience. I don't feel like any two Sturges films are similar enough to do that with. Like, what is the thing he's doing? And that's really remarkable, given that I think there is such a uniformity, especially in the films that he made earlier in his career when he was still at Paramount.
His admiration for Lubitsch was such that he tried and failed to have the opening image of his directorial debut, The Great McGinty. He wanted that to open with a title card thanking Ernst Lubitsch. And then he later got his revenge by name-dropping Lubitsch in Sullivan's Travels like 1,000 times.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Say, who's being sorry for who? Am I buying you the eggs or are you buying me the eggs?
Just like to repay you for them.
All right, give me a letter of introduction to Lubitsch.
I might be able to do that, too. Who's Lubitsch?
Drink your coffee.
The thing about Sturges that I think is often missed because he's so often kind of seen as a comparison to Wilder, which I think there's some very distinct differences there. But one such difference is that Sturges is, I think, an utter formalist. His films are so tightly controlled visually and texturally. His way with master shots is so uniform throughout his career, even when he's making things as different. I mean, as different as the first half of Sullivan's Travels and the last half of Sullivan's Travels. He has this incredibly tightly wound and I think also ideologically consistent way of designing his films.
Absolutely. And I think in general, filmmakers of that era just had to think more about blocking than they necessarily do because they used wider shots. They had theatrical actors coming in more often than not. But I still think even within that standard, Sturges really, really cares about the position of actors' bodies in very dense sets. Like, I wouldn't say that his films feel cluttered, but they feel very full. And like, I'm thinking of sort of the midway scene in Lady Eve when it's that breakfast sequence happening, or any of the train scenes in the Palm Beach Story.
In Joe McElhaney's essay, Fast Talk, which basically dissects Sturges's use of extremely fast-paced dialogue, he makes the point that Sturges, in his incredibly dense dialogue that you mentioned, often stages it in a way to maximize clarity. It sounds like it's full of overlapping moments of like frames that are cluttered, orally in this case, but very rare that he actually lets dialogue go by without its essentially meaning being totally clear. I think a good example of that, and this is another cluttered frame, is the big opening scene in Sullivan's Travels, right?
Oh, yes.
Which, especially the second part of it, when they leave the screening room, Sullivan has just screened the ending of his previous film in which Capital and Lever kill each other. The second half of it takes place in one long, multi-minute mastered shot that is just this rat-a-tat dialogue. And yet, I don't think there's a single line in that scene that actually competes with other lines for it. It's very disciplined in how it's kind of put across.
How about a nice musical?
How can you talk about musicals at a time like this with the world committing suicide, with corpses piling up in the street, with grim death gargling at you from every corner, with people slaughtered like sheep?
Maybe they'd like to forget that.
Then why do they hold this one over for a fifth week at the music hall? For the ushers?
It died in Pittsburgh.
Like a dog.
What do they know in Pittsburgh?
They know what they like.
If they knew what they liked, they wouldn't live in Pittsburgh.
Absolutely. And, I think to the point that it's a long take, which it is, and it's not the sort of thing you think about. Like, it's not like one of those bravura, like, look at how I can keep this film balanced for minutes at a time. It feels almost more like the film is taking pity on us by not asking us to keep up with cuts on top of everything else. I would sort of contrast it a little bit with another scene later in the film that I think is another just really great how the staging helps push the dialogue forward. It's when Joel McCrea and Veronica Lake are in the diner and she's sort of going through her pastiche, or she's, presenting her pastiche of the audition process. And she's kind of like acting out a full scene and we're watching her acting it out, but then it's also cutting back to the short order cook kind of responding to the scene she's acting out. And there's this really incredible interplay of these. They're technically reverse shots. I mean, that's kind of how the scene is built out, but it doesn't feel that way when you're watching it. So it does kind of train us early on to understand how dialogue is going to work so it can then start seeding in, I think, these more complicated ways of cutting. And not that that's the most complicated thing in the world, but I think it's a very well-built scene. It might be my favorite scene in the movie, honestly, that diner scene. It's certainly up there.
Sullivan is an interesting film for Sturges because one thing worth noting is that he had a very specific way of constructing his films on a macro level, right? Almost none of his films follow a 3-act structure, even if you can divide them into 3 broad acts. Like Lady Eve, you can kind of group everything into 3 big acts, but I think that's kind of missing the forest for the trees, where he essentially broke his films into what he would say 10-minute bits, 10 minutes of this, 10 minutes of that. Or in actuality, it's somewhere from, I think Adrian Martin in the commentary for Remember the Night calculates it as 7 to 20 minutes, which is nice and specific. And Sullivan's Travels is so interesting in that way for me because you can break it down into his 4 travels. He has his 4 journeys, 3 of which are aborted, the 4th of which truly changes him. But break those down further into kind of acts within those. And you can probably get it down to like 10 to 12 different distinct acts in the film. And that whole diner scene is essentially an act into itself. Certain scenes go on so long and the dynamics within each scene is kind of so well worked out. It's a perfect clockwork creation in that way. You get these fully self-contained dramatic packages in the film. Again, it makes the film feel kind of episodic, which it is, but each episode, it tends to be very rewarding.
It is. And, when you were saying that about the acts, it really resonated with me because one of the things that I was trying to grapple with this watch through, which I think is the 3rd time I've seen the film. It's very easy to say, as you pointed out, he has X number of travels. They sort of map onto a sort of 4-ish act structure. We could maybe fit it into 3 acts, although I think it would really, really be an uncomfortable fit. But it does almost feel like the unit of the film is the scene and not the act, which is a really remarkable way to structure a film like this. What it calls to my mind, and I'm using some anachronistic goggles here slightly, because as I'm sure we will eventually mention, because it is one of the things you have to talk about if it is later than the year 2000 and you are talking about Sullivan's Travels, is that the Coen brothers made a feature.
Sully, I just want to tell you that Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is going to be the greatest tragedy ever made. The world will weep. Humanity will sob.
It'll put Shakespeare back with the shipping news.
Just extremely self-consciously in dialogue with this film.
Whoa, whoa, whoa! You can't swear at my fiancé.
But I feel like the title Sullivan's Travels even gets us there without having to pull the Coens into it and their adaptation of the Odyssey. The title Sullivan's Travels kind of makes it have this sort of weird mock epic cadence in a way. And I feel like as I'm watching it, it feels a little bit like the Odyssey or the Aeneid or something like that, where like every scene becomes like one of many chapters isn't the right word. I think they call them books if you're reading Homer in most translations in English. But like these sort of narrative units that are all self-contained and form their own sort of very satisfying arc. But as you string them out, it doesn't feel like an arbitrary ordering the way that I think the phrase episodic can sometimes imply. They feel like they have to take place in this order. They feel like they build on each other, but it also feels like in the moment of watching it, the scene is sort of what matters the most and how will they get in and out of this scene.
Each of the 4 kind of travels, which also map onto Gulliver's Travels, but Sullivan's Travels maps onto a different genre too. Right? So you have the first travel, which is extremely over-the-top, wacky, slapstick car chase movie, essentially, right? And that's all it is. The second travel is a hobos on trains movie, and it's a little more of a down-to-earth comedy. It's still essentially comic. That's the one where he goes on an adventure with Veronica Lake. I'm assuming anyone listening to this episode, if you're this deep into the podcast, you've probably seen Sullivan's Travels, so I don't think we should recap. But the third travel is the first where the comedy is still present, but we're essentially in a social issues movie where we're finally being presented with what the film kind of pitches to in the moment as, oh, he's seeing the real wages of poverty, right? He's seeing the real social issues here. And then the fourth one is the big rug pull where he walks onto the set of I Was a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. That's the one that feels like a violation in terms of the contract the film has presented with you up to that point. You were told this is going to be a comedy with a little sex in it, but with some pathos, and then it becomes a drama with nary a joke for 15 or 20 minutes.
And it's not even like it's not funny because the jokes don't land. There aren't jokes. Like it stops having jokes. And I think as such becomes maybe the only protracted joke-free sequence that he ever directed. I haven't seen all of his later stuff, but I think they're all pitched as comedies. And it's a very remarkable thing that he does. I know we're going to probably spend a lot of time talking about that shift because it's so dramatic. I don't know if I think it works, honestly, but it's such a bold thing for a film to do, period. Certainly a film from 1941. Certainly this film, which has already sort of made its argument about what it thinks of serious art, like well in advance of that pitch happening. It's a brazen movie. I think is the word you used on Letterboxd. It is shocking.
Yes. It feels, I mean, I found it on my rewatch last night. I found it all very upsetting because, I mean, in your review, you mentioned that the film is essentially a broadside against the Message movie. It's a movie about how pointless social issue movies, self-serious movies are as made by the rich and cloistered in Hollywood, especially. And then the paradox of the film is that in making that case, Preston Sturges essentially makes one of those movies for about 20 minutes in this movie, essentially undercutting his entire premise.
It's a remarkable thing because this is a movie with a very loudly stated message. I don't know if I would say it's a clear message for the reason that it seems to undercut itself, but it is so strange for a movie to make an argument for an hour. This is what is true. This is what I, Preston Sturges, who knows everything there is to know about comic filmmaking, believe to be the case. And then to just so obviously violate that. Like, I don't know that I can name very many films that just go against their own sort of argument, or at least their own explicit argument, so dramatically for such a long stretch of time.
For me, that kind of puts it in the category of fundamentally interesting cinema, which to me is the highest form of cinema, where you can see, I mean, apparently, according to the James Harvey book, which the last quarter is entirely about Sturges, romantic comedy in Hollywood, this was all written very quickly in kind of a burst of inspiration, unlike something like Lady Eve, which you worked over extensively. This film was written almost, Mozart style, all in one go. And you can kind of feel that in that moment, can't you? Right? Where it feels like the movie has not had the chance to delve back and go, what are we doing here? Is this actually working on the terms we're setting out for ourselves?
Yeah, and I find it exciting. I find it exciting in part because like teasing out what this movie thinks is very complicated, which is weird given that it like has characters literally tell us the theme. I don't know. My brain is just kind of swirling around it because it is a very complicated thing. And it's, I think, easy to sum this up as the movie about how message movies are kind of stupid and not very good. But that is clearly, the movie is more ambivalent than that.
I will say that this movie, I think this might be more of a function of me thinking even more highly of Lady Eve and Morgan's Creek. This film kind of fell in my estimation of Sturges largely for this reason on my latest rewatch. And that's a very slight fall. It's me going from thinking it's an all-time masterpiece to just a really great film. And yeah, part of that is due to the film being a little bit at war with itself. But I also think that this feels like the one time that Sturges ever kind of let his rhetorical goals almost get a little bit in the way of the film's success as just a piece of narrative cinema that is meant to be enjoyed. That's another way in which it kind of undercuts its own message, right? Where the fact that he's so preoccupied, it isn't just a tonal thing of, hey, we're making a serious movie. It's, I'm preaching to you.
Exactly.
The movie is a slight bit preachy, which is to me a greater sin. And again, I love the film, but it's a slightly greater sin to me than the tonal inconsistency.
I would agree with that. I think there's a way that it works and there's a way that it doesn't work. I think early on, the butler says something, and this is, like I said, the film has sort of already made its argument before it starts making its argument. The butler has a line to the effect of, I don't think poverty is an interesting subject for cinema. The poor know all about it, and only the morbid rich would want to see it glamorized, which is a line that I think resonates with so many movies that have been made in the 83 years since Sullivan's Travels. But that to me is a funny line. At the end, when Joel McCrea is like ranting, that's not a fair word for it, but like when Joel McCrea sort of lays out the theme, I do get sort of bored with it. I do feel like the movie is kind of talking at me and not trying to entertain me. When the butler has his line, the movie is trying to entertain me.
I feel like maybe where my thoughts diverge a little from yours is that for me, I think it's worth noting too that the crime in the film, he is again sentenced to 6 years on a chain gang, partially as a result of a case of mistaken identity, but he actually did the crime he is being charged with. He actually almost murdered a man with a rock. Again, he was not in the right state of mind. He'd been hit on the head, but he was still given, in quotes, due process and sentenced to this. And I find that really interesting because that does situate the last part of this film as a almost pretty, I think, brutal polemic against the entire basis for the criminal justice system, at least how it's carried out in the US in the year 1940. And let's jump ahead to when he's sprung. We don't see how he actually gets out of the situation. He has the idea and we see how the Hollywood folks hear of him. But the thing that we don't see is it's very clear that him being freed from this chain gang is entirely a result of him being connected and having strings pulled, right? Like literally he is using his, what we would now call privilege, his wealth, his high class elite connections to get out of that chain gang. Everyone else who is in that chain gang with him does not have that option, even though I think the film is pitching that type of punishment as horrific and severe and inhumane. And for me, what sticks about that sequence, part of what makes it so powerful and upsetting for me, is that the film doesn't give you an out. most comedies, even Sturges comedies, at the end, no matter how serious they've gotten, they give you the happy ending. They give you an out. And in this film, there's that kind of unresolved thing where the film is actually almost, it feels like it's almost bitten off more than it can chew tonally. And you have to live with that upset in your stomach long after the film is over. And for me, that's what really impresses me about how far Sturges goes in the direction of, no, this is going to be the most brutal social issues movie you've ever seen circa 1940.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about the moment that you've pulled out, I think part of why it feels sort of weird and bitter, and what does, I think, speak to this being potentially something that Sturges was doing on purpose, and Sturges's own sort of relationship to politics is, I think, complicated in general, and certainly in regards to this specific movie, so it's possibly worth diving into that. But like, I do think he does a thing, very importantly, not very long at all before the mechanism that Sullivan uses to figure out, aha, I now know how to get back and start working my connections and doing all of this. I think Sullivan himself has a line that I don't actually have at my fingertips, unfortunately. But basically, if this was a picture, the only way to get out of this would be some sort of like terribly unsatisfying contrivance. And then the film gives us one, right? And I think that it's a weird, like almost adaptation, the movie adaptation-esque ploy of, I will tell you in advance that movies are bad when they do this certain kind of cheesy thing, and then I will do it. So the film has kind of proactively made us feel like this isn't a satisfying resolution, that it is kind of like corny and it is this unearned ending in a way. Like there is no way out. The only way out is just to turn it into this bizarre Hollywood bauble in a way by having headlines and so on and so forth. So I think the film is very aware of it being, no, this is a profoundly unjust and intractable situation. There is no way out of it other than just highly improbable movie magic.
I feel like that rhymes a little with, I think, the other major area that I think the film kind of gets caught up on its own feet in terms of whether it's primarily trying to be a meta kind of takedown of its own mechanisms or comedy that works on its own terms, is in the treatment of the Veronica Lake character, who is just named the girl, where this happens repeatedly in the film. She says, well, what's my part in this? And then, oh, there's always a girl in the picture.
How does a girl fit in this picture?
There's always a girl in the picture. Haven't you ever been to the movies?
By naming her the girl, the film is trying to call attention to the fact that she's only there because she's been shoehorned in because there's always a girl, right? But that does leave the film with having essentially Veronica Lake shoehorned in.
Right, exactly.
To varying degrees of success throughout, I would say.
Veronica Lake's presence in this movie is fascinating because I think a lot of it is, it's hard to say where exactly the difference between it's incongruous because Hollywood movies of the 40s don't actually want to depict ugly, horrible things, and how much of it is it's incongruous on purpose. But we have this just absurdly gorgeous woman pretending to be like a scruffed up hobo boy for a certain stretch of the movie, and just in general being like homeless and on the run and whatnot. And she is throughout Veronica Lake, and she has that like very specific, perfect wavy, it's not quite the peekaboo bob thing yet, the peekaboo bangs, but like she's very put together, she's very gorgeous. And it does seem kind of ridiculous that she's trying to be the role that the film has assigned to her in terms of like this wise source of street wisdom. And I think that to a certain extent, Veronica Lake is playing it that way enough that it feels like she is that character. At the same time, I can't tell if the movie is trying to get us to realize that it's ridiculous or not.
It's one of those things where the film doesn't quite commit to fully being a skeleton, where the real meat of what the movie's trying to do is the meta skeleton calling attention to its rickety interior, or whether, again, we're supposed to take her as an actual character worth caring about. She's fleshed out enough that we're invested in her, but we're kind of not.
Exactly. And I mean, the film flags lightly. You already quoted with a little sex in it, which I think is maybe the most famous line from this movie. Like, we're sort of told, again, way before any of this happens, when you take a serious issues drama and you shove bits and pieces of Hollywood melodrama into it, that's going to feel artistically inauthentic. And then lo and behold, in comes Veronica Lake. And does she fit? Does she not fit? Does the movie want her to fit? And these are sort of the ambivalences that I think it's cool that the movie's playing with. I think it's very, very neat that it is aware of what's going on here. I don't know that it lands. I think maybe part of the issue I have with this movie, which I do love, I mean, I have this as a 4.5-star movie.
We are focusing so much on, I think, the most interesting part of the film, which is the ways in which it maybe doesn't fully succeed, when we both love this movie.
I would rank it, I think, just a hair below you. I would have it as not higher than the 4th best Preston Sturges film. I would also put The Palm Beach Story ahead of it, and maybe The Great McGinty and a couple others. I feel like one of the problems this movie is facing is that it came up before postmodernism was invented, basically. And there's just like, there's not a toolkit for that kind of auto critique that I think is what Sturges has in in mind. I think that is where he wants the film to be, is this kind of constantly pointing out the things it's doing as being sort of false and unsatisfying, but neither he nor the edifice of studio filmmaking in 1941 can really make room for that, because this still does have to be a film where Veronica Lake is a sexy movie star.
It is interesting seeing kind of these proto-postmodern films. I don't know if you've seen Hell's a Poppin' from actually, I think the same year.
I never have.
It's essentially, it's a Zucker film 40 years ahead of schedule. That's fully what it is.
Yeah, no, it's one of those films I'm saving for a rainy day, because I know it's going to be a pretty special first encounter.
That film too has so many of the things that we would later call postmodern, but it doesn't have the language or the syntax to tie it all together yet into a coherent package. It's just, in that film's case, it has almost the opposite, I don't want to say issue, but it kind of falls on the opposite end of the spectrum as this film, where there is no message. It's not trying to actually be anything. It is a series of gags strung together, and that's all it has any ambition to be. But it doesn't quite actually cohere into like a postmodern statement on the state of film in any kind of real way. It's just very funny. It's surprisingly hard to find writing on Sturges in terms of long form writing. And I finally tried to, in the few weeks leading up to this, really familiarize myself with some of the scholarship on him. And it's interesting how alive kind of part of the debate, at least in a small way over the past 50 years about Sturges, has been, is he a cynic? Is he a satirist? Is he fundamentally critical of the American dream? Adrian Martin would say no to all three of those. But it's a fascinating thing because in the case of Sullivan's Travels, the film is making a pretty idealistic point in a funny way of, hey, this comedy is the noblest of human endeavors. We are making the world a better place through a comedy. And when you deconstruct each of his films, there's this almost cynical facade where characters are often really hard-edged, right? I mean, Lady Eve seems like a very, on the surface, it has the usual things we might expect in a film that I think is a little cynical, like Trouble in Paradise. You have characters who are amoral or fighting against characters who are stuck up. But then, you know, you have something like Christmas in July, which is a film that constantly teases you with a really unhappy conclusion that never happens.
Right.
It ends up being a profoundly heartwarming film in a really weird, trollish way.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
I read some of the pieces that you put in front of me, because again, as you point out, there's just not that much to read about it. And that question of, is he a cynic, really struck a chord with me, because I've never thought to question whether or not he is. And as I started rolling it around in my head, I find it very hard to say that he's cynical. I think he is, I mean, sophisticated might be the word for it. Like, there's a knowingness, right? Like, there's sort of, again, as with Lubitsch, there is a degree of caustic irony that comes along with knowing too much of how the world works and having no ability to be sentimental about it. But at the same time, I do think that he is someone who wants us to feel along with his characters. And actually, the Lady Eve was the one that really kind of struck me as being maybe the he's not a cynic argument. And the reason I would say this, and I'd be curious to know your thoughts on this. So we have here a sort of very classic Barbara Stanwyck style character, right? She's a fast talker, really hard-boiled dialogue, real sarcastic and cynical, and thinks she knows all the angles. Feels like a great sort of screwball character written by adults for adults. But then what is the pivot? Like, what is the plot of this movie is that her feelings are hurt and it's not fair that they were. And so she's lashing out at the person who hurt her because all of that sort of psychological callous of, oh, I'm too smart, oh, I'm too well-spoken, et cetera, don't disguise the fact that she still has feelings and they still can be hurt. And I think that's why we're rooting for her in the second half, is because it wasn't fair. And she should get back at Henry Fonda because he was a jerk. That to me speaks to a level of like rooting for the characters and loving the characters, not Henry Fonda's character necessarily, but certainly Barbara Stanwyck's, that I think is hard for me to call cynical.
James Harvey's Romantic Comedy in Hollywood. There's an interesting kind of little deconstruction of the Henry Fonda character in that film, where, you know, he starts out the film as kind of a fop. He starts out the film as a fool that you feel bad for, but you also want to, again, we see most of that act through Stanwyck's eyes, right? Famously of the mirror scene where we're kind of introduced to Henry Fonda via her own gaze.
Oh, you don't like her either. Well, what are you going to do about it? Oh, you just can't stand it anymore. You're leaving. These women don't give you a moment's peace, do they? Well, go ahead. Go sulk in your cabin. Go soak your head and see if I care.
But he undergoes two big shifts throughout the film, where in the second act, it is kind of revealed to us that he is actually extremely self-serious and stuck up. And then in the third act, that second act version of him is further problematized as he essentially has a crisis of personality. And so it's an interesting, what Martin kind of concludes in that essay is that unlike Lubitsch, Sturges' kind of morality, his moral kind of compass is gauged more towards this idea that people who have one idea of themselves, usually really straight straight-laced and almost repressed. I think they lose that sense about themselves. They become more impulsive. They become freer. So almost this idea of, and again, this also applies to Sullivan, right? He has a very set idea of who he is. He wants to be a serious artiste who takes the plight of the working man, the poor, seriously. And at the end, he learns how to laugh at himself.
I think this sort of gets at, I hinted before that I was going to want to make you talk about Preston Sturges in politics, because I think he's a strange beast as far as that goes. This is a comes from family money conservative film director. Like, that's just who he is. But what I think is interesting is that in so many of his films, I think there's a sort of Capra-esque element, who I guess, of course, is also, a sort of right-wing figure. In both Sullivan's Travels and The Lady Eve, and I think some of the others as well, having money kind of predisposes characters to being jerks that we don't like, in a way. If I had to kind of tease out the message here, it would be, if you have that kind of money, you're a rich person, you're Henry Fonda in The Lady Eve, you're Sullivan in Sullivan's Travels, and there's that scene that I hadn't really thought about until just this moment, where the two studio executives are talking about, like, you started making so much money so fast, and the one executive kept being like, when I was your age, I was making like 6 cents an hour, and it's like, there's this very clear sense of like, Sullivan has lots of money, and I think part of the joke is, if you have that much money, you won, the world is your oyster, the least you can do is not be like a tiresome bore about it. And like, if you look at the family around Henry Fonda in Lady Eve, they're all kind of like, you're a ridiculous stick in the mud, we're rich, we don't have worries, so let's not be serious people. And I think that's kind of Sullivan as well. Like, if you have that much money, you don't have problems, so just don't make yourself have problems, basically.
I think it's James Harvey who describes Sturges as the anti-Capra, in the sense of he shares a lot with Capra, right? He has an idealistic belief in the potential of a can-do kind of American individuality, right? I mean, that's Christmas in July almost. It's the ultimate fake it till you make it film, where he's faking it without realizing it, and then he makes it by his own sheer force of belief in himself, brought on by this happenstance. But in Lady Eve, the Henry Fonda character is, I think Harvey says, he's a Mr. Deeds, but in Mr. Deeds who we don't feel bad for being punished. Right? He's like the flip side of the Capra innocence, where it's not just that he's an innocent. He's not Mr. Deeds, guy who's untarnished. He is willfully blind. There's a blurry line between innocence and willful ignorance that the Fonda character stumbles right over, literally, in a few cases.
Absolutely, yeah. I feel like there's enough affinities between Capra and Sturges that I wouldn't necessarily want to call him the anti-Capra, but I do think there's such a markedly different tone in those films about money and about class. And, I do think that it does kind of speak to, and, back to the question of, is Sturges cynical? I think that he is certainly someone who is cynical about money. He is, I think, someone who believes that there is no merit in being the kind of person who succeeds. And in a way that I think that Capra does believe, if you're a hard worker and you succeed, that is a reflection on your moral goodness. And I think Sturges would be likelier to say, if you're a hard worker and you succeed, you got lucky.
This is well expressed in Sullivan's Travels, right? I mean, the scene where in so many films, the hero giving out money to the poor is this triumphant moment. I watched the film, It Could Happen to You, where they give out money and it's this, oh boy, aren't they generous? In this film, the scene where Sullivan just gives $100 bills to a bunch of vagrants, the film is profoundly torn on how to portray this. It isn't this sad thing. It feels like the film truly doesn't know how to feel about this. Sturges kind of reminds me of Ford in this way, where he's very difficult to talk about in generalizations, where there's so much self-contradiction in his politics.
Absolutely.
The Manny Farber essay, Success in Film, one of its many things it's about Sturges' idea of success, where he is simultaneously this kind of huckster, right? He is truly just this very entrepreneurial American type in the stereotypical sense. And also someone who saw himself as an artist. He was both those things at once, and those two things came into tension with each other, and he would often play those elements of his personality off each other to frustrate people. Whether it be a film like Sullivan's Travels, where we as people who see film as maybe more of a formal aesthetic thing are frustrated by certain elements that he brings to this, and others might be frustrated by the incompleteness of certain other elements, right? All of his films feel like the work of not a malcontent mind, but an unsettled mind, but especially Sullivan.
Yeah, no, definitely. He's a dense filmmaker, right? Like he's someone who is, as you said, there's a kind of Fordian level of, it's really hard to say he does X, because you will find examples of him doing not X.
Not even Y, opposite of X.
Opposite of X, exactly.
Yeah.
And what you say that about the sort of huckster artist, and what this is all actually kind of making me think about in a weird way, is The Sin of Harold Diddlebach, which is one of his last films. Very strange, compromised object, the result of a very ill-advised collaboration between him and Howard Hughes to try and create an independent movie studio. It's his love letter to Harold Lloyd, where he tries to create a sequel to Harold Lloyd's silent film, The Freshman. But it does feel in a way that it is kind of tied into all of this because it is Harold Dittelbach, the character in the movie, is someone who works hard and toils endlessly and he gets nowhere from it. And then he kind of flails about in this catastrophic drunken fit. And then all of a sudden he becomes interesting and not necessarily a better person, but a more likable, colorful person. And I do feel like there's something to that level of being a huckster as an art form that maybe is being gotten at in that film. And what you just said kind of makes me wonder if it's more autobiographical in a way, or at least autobiographical of an ideology, if not life details.
Two films actually, because they were written by the same people, that come to mind as a comparison here to this element are Singing in the Rain and The Bandwagon. Because those films are much less auteurist statements than this. I mean, they were written by a team, directed by two different filmmakers, Minnelli and Kelly, and also Donnan, three filmmakers. Yet both of them celebrate this idea of, if you really want to be uncharitable to them, they're anti-intellectual art on both those movies. And again, that's just on paper. I don't think either of those films much cares. But for me, what's interesting about the comparison of kind of what we're getting at with Sturges here, this kind of idea of the almost elevation of the huckster in those films, is that I think Sturges manages to never really feel anti-intellectual in any way.
No, definitely not.
To me, it almost feels like he has certain beliefs that are in conflict with each other, right? I think this gets at how hard it is to talk about Sturges. He really feels like someone who is skeptical of his base impulses. That's a good way to put it. So for example, to go back to the comparison, something like The Bandwagon doesn't feel like it is ever conscious of the contradictions within it, where The Bandwagon is essentially about, a major plot line of that film, which I deeply love. It's maybe my favorite Freed Unit film. It's all about a very pretentious theater director, an Orson Welles character, being humbled and just going, well, make them laugh, or that's entertainment in the case of The Bandwagon.
Everything that happens in life can happen in a show. You can make them laugh, you can make them cry. Anything can go.
And how, let's just all have a good time, make some entertainment. Whereas when Sturges does it, which is the case with Sullivan's Travels, in the sense of, if I were to write 5-word, 10-word elevator pitch for both films, they would both be pretty similar in that sense. But I don't feel like Sturges fully believes in himself the way the Bandwagon unproblematically does.
No, there's definitely something there. And, to the question of, are these quote unquote anti-intellectual art, it's always complicated. And I think artists in general are more interesting when they don't know what they're saying. They're just trying to feel their way through it using the art piece. And I think of Gene Kelly as someone who decided at a certain point in his career, not very far past Singing in the Rain, you know what the American public wants? They want a 2-hour movie with ballets and no dialogue. And that's going to sell. And of course, it was, just an absolute catastrophe of a movie. And very interesting broken film. I'm referring to Invitation to the Dance. It's 3 ballet pieces. It's just Gene Kelly dancing. Interesting movie, weird movie. So I think that, there's this push-pull, what artists think they're saying, what they're trying to say, what they're actually saying. And I think that that's certainly true in general of Sturges and extremely true of Sullivan's Travels. But, to this point of where does he feel about intellectualism, about merit, potentially, if we can use that word, and elitism, maybe. I keep wanting to try and find, is there somewhere where we can situate him on a scale of populism? I would say Frank Capra is a populist filmmaker. I think he believes in the little guy taking down the big guy. That's over and over again, it's true. And, the word populism has a lot of baggage that I don't think Capra deserves or earns, but it has other connotations that I think he does. And I keep wanting to say, is Sturges a populist filmmaker? Is Sullivan's Travels a populist film? And that doesn't fit. And I think it doesn't fit in a way because these are educated movies, if that makes sense. These movies went to college. He's working through ideas. He's not just working through sort of gut instincts. And I think a filmmaker like Gene Kelly or a filmmaker like Frank Capra is kind of working through gut instincts. And I think Sturges has read too much to have a gut instinct.
He feels like someone who's constantly riven by second-guessing himself in funny ways. This is also what provokes Manny Farber to declare him one of the few Hollywood filmmakers to ever qualify as a truly modern artist. Right? So I think that gets at it, right? Where he is simultaneously deeply populist in very compartmentalized ways, but he's also the type of director who will do something like Open Palm Beach Story with a 4-minute chain of nonsense that only makes sense if you remember it 90 minutes later and remember that, oh, those were twins. Oh, I guess it makes sense now, but the movie's over. You're out of the cinema. Right? He's the type that will like overcomplicate a joke. I actually had a debate with someone on Twitter years ago. I was about to write a little tweet about my appreciation of the title Ants in Your Pants of 1939. But I went, is that actually the title? Went back and it turns out it's Ants in Your Plants of 1939. And then I tweeted that and I got 2 or 3 people responding, it's Ants in Your Pants. And I had to like actually find the original script to prove it to them.
How about making Ants in Your Plants of 1941? You can have Bob Hope, Mary Martin.
Maybe Bing Crosby.
Yeah, but dancers.
Maybe Jack Benny and Rochester.
A big name band.
Point being, Sturges is the type that will take a perfectly reasonable joke like Ants in Your Pants of 1939 and rewrite it to be Ants in Your Plants of 1939 because he doesn't want to take the populist road in that way. He overthinks everything. Even in the film that's written in a spree like Sullivan's Travels, I feel like there's no joke he ever just lets be the joke you think it'll be. He always has to complicate it in some funny way that makes it a weird alien version of itself.
That's especially interesting in this case because like the explicit thing he's trying to tell us is that the people who make Ants in Your Plants of 1939 are doing the Lord's work and the people who make Hold Back the Dawn are not. Really great slam on Mitchell Lyson, the specific filmmaker who's so badly pissed off Sturges that he decided to become his own director.
Oh, no wonder. There's nothing like a deep dish movie to drive you out in the open.
What are you talking about? Film's the greatest educational medium the world has ever known. You take a picture like Hold Back Tomorrow.
You hold it. Did you ever meet Lubitsch?
And Wilder. He birthed 2.
He did. And I'm a Lyson fan. I think Mitch Lyson is a good director, but like he does not know how to direct a Sturges script. That is very true. But I still really enjoy that very low-key dig. But he's clearly saying like Ants in Your Plants of 1939 matters and Hold Back the Dawn does not. But then he does do exactly this thing you've just said where he can't just make it be the funny joke. He has to make it this kind of weird second guessing yourself, having to consult the script to make sure that the gag was what you thought the gag was.
And yet my takeaway coming out of this film is I still don't get the sense that he ever actually, the title Ants in Your Plans from 1939, the way it's used in the film, at no point, even now, do I feel like the film is actually advocating that film. That hypothetical film or Hey Hey in the Hayloft. It's just so patently ridiculous and probably terrible and also implied to be corporate, pablum because remember they encouraged him to make Ants in Your Plans in 1941, which I wonder what series he's making a dig at there. Is it like the Gold Diggers?
Probably the Gold Diggers would be my guess. Although I guess the Broadway Melody was the one that was still a going concern. I don't think Gold Diggers was by 1941.
I still don't get a sense that he's actually, again, we keep saying on paper he's doing this, but yet in practice, he's kind of not advocating the thing the film is advocating. It's very weird.
It's even more complicated and weird because in the film, Veronica Lake, who I think is being positioned as someone we trust. It's clear that Sullivan is an idiot. It is not clear what other characters are or are not idiots. Veronica Lake at one point says, basically, I didn't like Ants in Your Plants of 1939, but I did like Hey Hey in the Hayloft. So it's like, even within this, like, are these good or bad films? He's kind of not letting us settle on that, even as kind of like broadly described silly comedies.
I want to compare all this to Wilder again, because it's so interesting to me that another debate is Wilder a cynic? But the dimensions of that debate are basically the two camps tend to be he's a cynic. He's a disappointed romantic. There's no argument that he's idealistic at all. Right? Both of those are very dark, and I don't feel like those two things are incompatible. I feel like, okay, it's very clear that humanity has done many things to disappoint Billy Wilder for many valid reasons. He does not trust people or politics or anything. I mean, this is the man who was driven out of Austria and Berlin by the Nazis, who later killed many of his family members. The guy has the credentials to be disappointed in humanity. To me, Wilder is like a clear-cut case of, okay, I kind of get what the guy's doing. The debate to me seems like hair splitting of like, what is the root cause of his cynicism? Right? Versus Sturges. We've been talking about Sturges for about an hour now. I do not feel like I have any better grasp on what to make of the man's politics or his outlook on humanity.
No, that's, I think, a fascinating thing because I feel like I had a better grasp before we started this conversation than I do now. I would say Sturges is definitely someone, if nothing else, to sort of build on the Wilder comparison. Sturges likes some of his characters, and I don't know that Billy Wilder really likes any of his characters a lot. Some of them. He likes Sabrina, I think, but there's not a lot of his characters that he likes. Whereas I think at least in every one of his films, there's at least one character that Sturges is like, this is the character who you should all be listening to.
And for example, Lady Eve, that's the Stanley character.
Mm-hmm.
And she is not a morally upstanding person. Although I think if we're kind of doing the Sturges world of morality, she's an angel because she's a smoother operator than anyone else. So therefore she is virtuous.
Exactly. And I think there's a sense that like what she's doing in that movie is victimless because the only people who suffer from it are rich.
And, at the end, they end up together. She falls in love.
Exactly. But yeah, no, it's tough. It's very tough to get a beat on Sturges because he's one of those filmmakers who is just so clearly smart. And whether the individual films are always smart, I don't think matters. He is an intelligent person who is making sure his scripts require you to pay attention all the time. And I mean, I think maybe part of what we're viewing is like these things that are hard to pin down. I think maybe to a certain extent, Sturges doesn't want us to pin him down.
Mm-hmm. I think he resents being pinned down. Part of why, I think one thing that's worth noting with Sturges is that he had a notoriously meteoric rise and a equally incredible flame out. It's actually interesting seeing he had a very messy career with Paramount, and then he ended up going off with Daryl Zanuck. Didn't work out. He ended up coasting around a couple studios. None of that worked out. And he, died at the age of 61 of a heart attack.
Something like that, yeah.
He barely made it past the Lubitsch threshold. It's very weird to me because it feels like there's very little that would have kept him from just making great movies for a while, other than his own kind of insatiable need for speed and kind of seeming self-destructiveness.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I mean, I mentioned Harold Dittelbach already. I think that's the kind of mistake that ends a career. Like it was a business mistake. It was not an artistic mistake per se, but I think it did completely flame him out. You mentioned the meteoric rise and fall. And I mean, like, I don't have the film titles right in front of me, but I think like the core of his career, like the sort of main body of films as a screenwriter and a director, that's basically 39 to 44, if I recall correctly. I don't think there's anything truly significant past 45. I mean, there's films, obviously, great films, but like I feel that's kind of the period of productivity is 39 through 44. That's very short for the number of films in question.
And even then, he was also a victim of that classic Hollywood thing of they only care about if your last one was a flop, right? Because you had Lady Eve, big success, Sullivan's Travels, and Palm Beach Story, mixed results. And then Morgan's Creek, it was in post-production hell for like a year and a half or 2 years. That and Conquering Hero were huge successes, massive. And then The Great Moment, Harold Dittelbach torches his career. And then Unfaithfully Yours is a favor by an executive for him, giving him another shot. It didn't work out. That movie is a very weirdly sour movie. I love that movie, but it is also a downer in a funny way, even though it's extraordinarily funny.
And it's a film I owe a second watch. The first watch, I was expecting more of Paramount Sturges, and it ain't that.
No, it's funny to say this, but 7 years after Sullivan's Travels, not a long time, by 48, he was a bitter old man. And Unfaithfully Yours is very clearly the work of a distinctly embittered person. It's a sour, sour movie, even though it has the funniest kind of Acme type gags I've seen in a while. And yeah, he never made anything of particular note after that.
There's The Beautiful Blonde and there's The Medals of Major Thompson. I think that's kind of it.
It's interesting how one thing that a couple of the pseudo biographies I've read on him have pointed out is that he kind of pulled an Orson Welles. He tried to, and it didn't work. It didn't work as well as it did for Welles, for whom it didn't work that well.
Yeah, whom it famously worked so well. Orson Welles had such a productive and wonderful career.
I do think Welles is another very interesting parallel where Sturges kind of did the Welles thing before Welles, right? He was a final cut on his films. He was still the hot young thing on the studio lot who flamed out really young. The difference was Welles lived much longer and he was also much younger when he flamed out and made a lot of great films in the independent circuit. Sturges never made it work outside the Hollywood system.
It's kind of remarkable that that career could happen the way it did, just because we don't think of comedy films in the 40s as sort of being the place that you can get yourself into that kind of artistic heights followed by artistic trouble. That's also part of why he's an interesting case. Is like he's kind of Hollywood's first like writing, directing auteur, and he chooses to spend this energy in silly sex farces, basically, as compared to like massive controversial biopics of notable journalist figures. Like there's a weird sense in which he is doing this like major art in this kind of weirdly small, frivolous setting, which is, to a certain extent, the idea that Sullivan's Travels is even trying to get at.
It's interesting that you mentioned the idea of like, we don't usually associate this type of comedy with rank auteurism. And I think that to me, that is one of the central tragedies of cinematic history is that relationship has not been more accepted.
Right. And I mean, that's kind of the spirit of this podcast, right? Because you've got Ernst Lubitsch as sort of maybe the defining comedy auteur of his generation, maybe the defining comedy auteur in a sense. And so we're sort of trying to reclaim comedy as a space for that sort of work.
I mean, that is one of my most deeply held beliefs. Did I ever tell you about the tweet I made once? I feel like I've talked about 2 tweets on this episode, and that's too many. But I said, theaters are designed for comedies. Action blockbusters are for DVD. I think I was drunk. It was a joke. But that got the most surprisingly vociferous reception.
Which is unfortunate because it's true. It is simply true.
And to me, it really speaks to certain associations come up. It's like widescreen is cinematic, right? Widescreen is accepted as cinematic because a bunch of marketers decided that in the 50s. Cinematic in air quotes. And comedy is for Netflix because that's what is marketed as Netflix films. So it becomes reified. It becomes true.
I think there's a certain self-fulfilling prophecy there, self-fulfilling tragedy even. It's like with children's entertainment, we expect it to be lesser than, so we don't demand it not be lesser than. And so it is lesser than. Like we get these, like comedy is Netflix now because people assume that the comedy is Netflix in a way, as opposed to like demanding. I mean, I will say this, like I saw Asteroid City. And it was the hardest I've laughed at anything in probably literally years. And it was in a theater, and it was in a theater full of people who were on the film's vibe. And that's not something you get outside of a theater. Now, Wes Anderson obviously is visually oriented in a way a lot of comedies aren't. But like, imagine if I had met that film the way that I met his next project, the Henry Sugar and Other Roald Dahl adaptations, which are delightful and charming, but like I didn't have that opportunity to experience them in that kind. I experienced them on Netflix, literally.
Yeah.
I didn't have the ability to kind of enjoy the group appreciation of this weird vibe. And that's, I think, what comedy needs.
I mean, comedy is seen as small. That's why the party line on comedy now is that the only way to get a comedy funded is to make it a hybrid, right? It has to be The Lost City or something like that, right? Where it's an action movie that has comedy. It has to be Guardians of the Galaxy. And you can't just get a straight comedy funded unless you're okay with it only ever being seen by people in their individual rooms.
Sure.
That's so sad to me.
You know, I had an experience a few years ago. I think it was right before the pandemic. I saw for the first time ever His Girl Friday in a theater full of people because it was a class I was teaching and the undergraduates had to watch it. And they weren't really super into it, if I'm being honest. Like, it's a type of humor that I think if you don't know what the type of humor is, it's hard to figure out how to get there. So no one was really enjoying it like a lot other than me, but I was really enjoying it more than I had enjoyed it in a very long time. That's a movie I've seen so many times. I just don't really laugh at it anymore because the jokes are too familiar to me. But seeing it in that context, in a room full of people, even if they weren't like vibing with it, we're still kind of responding to its cadences and seeing those images, you know, not on a TV, but seeing them, you know, on a wall, like it changes the mood, it changes the rhythm. And I do think it's really just a horrible shame that we've decided that because these are not where our A-list cinematographers decide to spend their time, that these are not legitimate forms of visual media.
In a big way, an audience completes a comedy. I've had the distinct privilege of screening with audiences of various sizes. In the past year, I've done Trouble in Paradise, The Merry Widow, and Ninotchka, the last 2 of which I was invited by local cinema manager Tom Charity to screen at the local festival cinema. And it was a profoundly different experience than watching them the way I've watched almost every Lubitsch film, which is at home with a group of 5 people or less. We showed Trouble in Paradise to a group of first-year film students, actually, at UBC. And it was electric. I was worried because, again, it's not a belly laugh film, but the students really got it. It was like, oh, wow, this film is truly funny. You realizing that if even like a quarter of the students give themselves permission to laugh at a 90-year-old film, the rest laugh because they have been given permission to laugh at these jokes that don't fit maybe people's first idea circa 2023, what counts as a joke. It was lovely. And we had similar experiences with Ninotchka and The Merry Widow, which is that when you have an audience and you have that critical mass where if even one person laughs, the rest of the audience has to think about what was funny and try and empathize with that one person who's laughing. And then you have these waves of laughter. I feel like I'm just talking about how comedy works in crowds, but it works well, people.
It does. These were movies meant to be seen in theaters. These were not movies meant to be seen, you know, not that there was another option, but they deserve it.
I feel like it's a good way to kind of tie off this episode is a full-throated defense of the utility of the theatrical experience in comedy and how essential that is. These comedies were designed with audiences in mind. They were designed with a room full of people in mind.
Absolutely.
They're different experiences without them. I have one question for you.
Yes.
Non sequitur, but I have to ask, because Sturges, one thing we haven't mentioned is that he has maybe the most stable stock company of any director in history.
Oh, man. You're going to ask me this question. Oh, my God.
Who is your favorite and why is it William Demarest?
Oh, I almost am willing to agree that it's William Demarest, but I feel like I'm cheating on Eugene Pallett if I say that.
Oh, I mean, Eugene Pallett's great.
There's just, don't make do this or make me pick my children, man. I will say that Demarest probably has, how to phrase this in a way that doesn't diminish the rest of the cast. I think that Demarest has to do the most work to make the timing. He gets the jokes that you need absolutely airtight timing. Whereas I think like Eugene Pallett, he gets to be the big burly guy who shouts, and that's just inherently funny. I think Demarest has to like kind of actually think about how he's delivering his lines and make sure he's delivering that correctly. And I think there's more delicacy to what he's doing than I think maybe some of the other members of the cast, if that makes sense.
I'm glad that we're both Demarest fans. Demarest for me, I mean, I think Lady Eve is the one that he gets the most notice for because he does have the greatest final line ever.
Yeah.
Positively the same dame.
And that's kind of what I was thinking of. And I was like, you can ruin that whole movie if that final line doesn't work. So like a lot lies on him delivering it correctly.
And yet I still think his work in Morgan's Creek is his pinnacle as a comic performer. That his physical work in that film is poetry. It's incredible. Well, thank you so much, Tim. I mean, I feel like this is one of the most exhausting episodes I think we've recorded. And you were on the Clooney Brown episode, which was going on 3 hours and took 2 sessions.
There you go.
Weirdly was more exhausting because I think it's so hard to wrap our arms around this very slippery figure.
I feel the difference is that Lubitsch solves himself in a way. We just have to keep up with him. Sturges makes a lot of demands of us. And I think that is maybe the difference between these two. I mean, there's not that Lubitsch doesn't make demands of us, but I think it's really more just a matter of, did we come prepared to feel what he was giving us? And I think Sturges is a more challenging, not challenging in a good way, but just challenging. He's just got more stuff that is not ready to pluck.
He's a puzzle that doesn't fit.
Yeah.
Pieces don't fit. Is Lady Eve still your favorite of his films?
It is. I mean, Miracle is just an absolute tremendous, tremendous film. But there's just, I'm a Stanley guy. So that gives it an unfair advantage over all the others.
Her work in that is, I think, some of the greatest acting ever committed to film.
It might be my favorite Stanley performance. And that's a competitive race. I would comfortably say my top 3 would be Lady Eve, Miracle at Morgan's Creek, and Palm Beach Story. And then the ranking gets a little tricky after that. Probably this next, but maybe McGinty comes out before that. And maybe Christmas in July comes before either of them. I don't know.
I was very surprised at how much I loved McGinty, given his reputation as like the one where he was still figuring things out. But Morgan's Creek is the only one where I have an interesting story about it because, and this is weirdly, this might be a good way for me to finish my thoughts on the whole episode. I was doing the Camino with my 2 roommates at the time, one of whom is, frequent guest on the show. And we were, I think, a month into our walk across Spain. And I tell you, the Camino was miserable, especially when you're dealing with bed bugs. And we were also making a documentary while doing it. It was a bad idea. Anyways, we hadn't watched a movie in almost a month.
Okay.
Right? Not seen a film. We had a hard drive, and that hard drive had 2 movies on it. One was Steven Spielberg's Duel. The other one was Miracle on Morgan's Creek, which none of us had seen.
Okay.
This is 2014, so we have a shitty netbook with like an 8-inch screen. So we're at our albergue, which is like a pilgrim's hostel. There's no internet. There's no power. We have like 2 hours of battery on this computer. We decide to boot up Morgan's Creek first. And I tell you, after not having seen a movie in a month and being miserable, sore, and drunk on the wine that they give you every night to dull the pain. True story. We all watch Morgan's Creek, and I tell you, I've never laughed harder at anything in my life, I think, than that viewing the 3 of us trying to hear on tinny speakers on an 8-inch screen.
Sure.
Every time I watch the end of Sullivan's Travels, it actually takes me back to that moment of, wow, Sturges, I wasn't on a chain gang in a church in the American South, but we were on the Camino, miserable and very hungry and quite drunk and really tired and done with the thing and riddled with bedbug bites. And that movie was the greatest salve we could have ever asked for. So
that is amazing.
Maybe Sturges was right.
Maybe.
So thank you so much, Tim. I've asked more than enough of your time.
No, always a pleasure. Always fun to come chat about old comedies with you, because old comedies are better than anything else I could have to talk about with people. So
next week, we're taking a little break. See you in a few weeks for the last 11 episodes of Season 5 and the end of our story, starting with a 2-parter episode featuring author and scholar William Paul. Head over to ernstcast.com for information as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing this season and other resources such as show notes and our Discord server. How Would Lubitsch Do It is a production of Moving Image Agency. Brennen King was our dialogue editor for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on whatever podcast platform you happen to use. It helps other people find our podcast and therefore find Ernst Lubitsch. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was produced on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.